This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. So, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Timothy Knotts, and I discuss books from Classical Conversations curated curriculum. Today is Wednesday, June 19th, 2024, and I'm Lee Bortons. Tim and Jennifer could not be here today, so we're happy to have Lisa Bailey, one of our lead curriculum developers, join us. And we also have Brittany Lewis and Kathy Denigi, who are curriculum developers for Classical Conversations Multimedia. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Lisa, you looks like you're taking over Jennifer's role, so I'll let you tell us about this month's shows.
Sure. This month, we are looking at parent resources across the challenge curriculum. And we started with the tour guide Introduction to Debate. And last week, we discussed Fallacy Detective by Nathaniel and Hans Bludorn. Now, today, we are going to talk about Consequence of Ideas by R.C. Sproul. And then next week on June 26th, we'll be talking about Notes from the Tilt-A-Whirl by N.D. Wilson.
Yeah, they're really interesting books, and they're a great introduction to all kinds of difficult ideas at a level that young children, I should say, young adults can approach, as well as their mothers and fathers. So if you want to access any of these episodes or our past episodes, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is at Lee Bortons. If you want to know the calendar from last year, as well as the calendar this year, and how to purchase the books that we are studying or discussing, you can go to leebortons.com, where there's links to everything. And I just look forward to hearing your feedback. So Lisa, what do we have? What's going on today?
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Consequences of Ideas by R.C. Sproul. And I know that what everybody wants to know is, why in the world do we have this book in our curriculum, Lee?
You know, when I was thinking about that question for today, I actually went way back to the very beginning. And as any good classical educator would do, the first couple of years, I just gave the students a list of very famous philosophers and said, go read their documents, go research them, go ahead and find out things, and come back and we'll have a discussion about the big ideas that you were able to study. Of course, not really realizing that, one, that was pre-internet, and a lot of them didn't know, they didn't have books on philosophers in their homes, and they didn't know, they'd heard of some of the names, but philosophy wasn't something probably even their parents had studied. So I was really pleased when a few years into Classical Conversations, we stumbled upon R.C. Sproul, and this is senior. He was still alive. He actually made a video encouraging us to study philosophy in Classical Conversations. But R.C. Sproul Senior put a book together called The Consequence of Ideas. And as I went through it, I'll just say real quick, because I'm sure we're going to talk about it some more, but he introduces some very ancient philosophers and then jumps right into what I call Plato and the three A's. Aristotle, Augustine, and then Aquinas. Yes, I think got them in the right order. And then he jumps into the modern philosophers and then into the contemporary modern philosophers. So it's a nice introduction and it's funny. So what happened is, even though in developing Classical Conversations, everybody wanted to have a classical curriculum, they weren't quite sure how to really do it like Nathaniel Bowditch and Carry On Mr. Bowditch would in going to get their own books and materials. So this book just really fit that bill of being approachable to the novice, as well as being fun and interesting. And now I think as we develop our our philosophy studies with Classical Conversations 25 years later, the parents have a whole lot of resources and a lot of classical materials have been put out. So I just really appreciate the time to talk about this classic, written by just a great man who was a big supporter of homeschooling in the early years.
So you just probably gave the best tagline advertisement ever. It's a philosophy book that is approachable and fun and interesting. Go buy it, okay? But let's go a little bit deeper than that. Brittany, you are the reasoning strand writer for classical conversations. And that's the strand where students are going to encounter consequences of ideas, understanding the concepts that shaped our world. So tell us about how reading this book is useful for teaching students in this reasoning strand.
Well, we want our students to develop fit minds that are able to discern truth from lies and wisdom from sophistry. We want them to be able to develop good logical arguments. And this book falls in our strand when students have had some good training in formal logic, and now they are going to have an opportunity to apply that as they sit at the feet of a really kind, solidly Christian, wonderful pastor, joyful man that R.C. Sproul was and is, I'm sure today, it's with Jesus, and learn how to detect from his example fallacies and things that the Christian would look at in the realm of philosophy and say, well, that's not a wise idea, or that's a illogical application here, or that doesn't work. So we want it's an opportunity when students read this book to be able to test some of those things while they're guided by a great mentor like R.C. Sproul.
That's so cool. It's actually, it comes about at the perfect time because they have the tools and they're ready to practice. And so you give them something good and somebody safe to practice with. I love that. So this is a student resource. And this month we are looking at student resources, but through the lens of using them as parents. Okay. So Kathy, you did this book with your kids. How can this book be used by parents and not just be something to hand to our students to study on their own?
You know, I think a lot of us busy homeschool moms are guilty of just, I call it throwing the book at the child and thinking they will
hoping it
glean
sticks
from it. Yeah, exactly. And that doesn't work. And especially with this book. Well, first of all, I think as parents, first of all, this book is the philosophers who have shaped Western thought and are still influencing our culture today. So if you're a parent who has read some philosophy and maybe understands some philosophy, I think it's a great summary to discuss with your children. If you're a parent like me who had never really done much in philosophy, when I first became aware of this book and read it through CC, it was such a great introduction just for me as a parent. But I think most of all, I think it's a great book to read either aloud with your child or at least alongside with them. The chapters are fairly short, a lot of deep thinking, but then that opens it up to all these ideas that you can discuss with your student. And, you know, as parents, we have a lot more life experience than our children. And we're able to make connections to the real world today and help our children see those. And so that's one thing I appreciated.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. I think a lot of times, even if we have students that, I mean, we could hand them the book and they would read it and they could glean the ideas for themselves. A lot of those students even would just pass their eyes over the words. They would just be reading it, just academic. I'm trying to get through all of this. And they wouldn't really chew on the ideas. And so I think you're right, Kathy. It takes conversation to do that. And it takes an interested parent who wants to help their child apply what they're reading to how they're thinking. That's really good.
And Lisa, the way you asked your question, I thought was really significant because you said, Kathy, how did you do this book with your kids? It was an activity. It wasn't like everyone thinks of, reading book as some passive thing you only do with your eyes. And it can be that way, but it also could be something you literally do with your children, like cooking or sleigh riding.
Right. That's a really good point. That probably the more active it is, the more active an activity it is, the more it sticks, the more memory it builds with our kids. So you mentioned already once, Brittany, that we're teaching our kids to detect fallacies. And we talked last week about equipping our children to argue well as we taught them about fallacies. R.C. Sproul begins this book, Consequences of Ideas, with an introduction that just flat out asks the question, why philosophy? Why is it important for our children to study philosophy? I'd love to hear what all of you say.
I think we know that the Bible is very clear about using our minds. I've been thinking a lot about the chapter of Romans 8 this summer. As my daughter and I, my youngest is about to be in Challenge 4, and we've so enjoyed discussing this book and others this past year. I've been thinking about the pursuit of wisdom.
Yes.
And that's really what philosophy is.
Mm-hmm.
It means the friendship with wisdom, or the love of wisdom. So it's important for us that we, as Christians, exercise our minds. Come, let us reason together. The Lord invites us in Isaiah, and really think about where ideas have come from and where we are in the stream of things.
Yeah, that's awesome. Somebody else.
Brittany, when you introduced yourself and answered the first question, you used the word sophistry. And as soon as you said that, I was thinking, wait a minute, sophistry, Sophia. Sophia means wisdom. Philosophy means wisdom. What does sophistry mean?
Yeah, that's so good. Thank you for saying that. So we know that rhetoric, the practice of rhetoric, is persuading others to the truth, or I think Plato said it was soul leading to the truth. And he very much spoke against the sophists, who were the wise ones. They seemed to be wise, and yet what they were doing was trying to manipulate their audience and get power. They didn't believe that truth existed, or if it did exist, we couldn't know it. If we could somehow know it, we could not communicate it to someone else. And so sometimes we hear rhetoric used as a derogatory term, like, oh, that's just a bunch of rhetoric. The true practice of it was leading someone to the truth, and actually the false practice of it is sophistry, be the opposite.
Good.
Good.
Thanks for explaining that to us. Yeah, because a lot of people will say, why are you studying philosophers that, why don't you just study Christ? That whole argument that if you study a real dollar bill, that's a way to know whether you have a fake dollar bill in your hand. And that's absolutely true. But sometimes you're trying to teach somebody else something, and you don't have a real dollar bill or a fake dollar bill in your hand. And it's helpful to have words and ideas and images you can cast through words and ideas. And so the study of philosophy sets you up to be able to just do that as a communication tool. So that's one reason to study philosophy. Well, another reason why we study this book is R.C. Sproul is very specific about Christian ideas and non-Christian ideas, but he doesn't ever personally attack any of these philosophers. He'll tell you, yeah, this is a good idea. This really reflects reality. This is true. And, recognizes that God's truth is always God's truth. And so by reading about these, I think it's 12 or 14, the philosophers, we give our children that ability to have a conversation with some like-minded students and a tutor who probably are all in the same boat, don't know much about any of the subject, but they can come and ask questions and not feel like they have to have a right or wrong reason, because there's not like right and wrong reasons in this book. Now, I don't want people to think it's situational ethics or anything like that. I'm just saying it's not dogmatically all Christian. He gives a nod to people when they say things that are true also.
Cool. I always thought that it was important to study philosophy. I wanted my girls to study, and I was glad that we did with through the Classical Conversations curriculum study philosophy. One of the things that I appreciated that he says in this book is, hey, the greater our familiarity is with the ideas that have shaped our culture over the centuries, then the greater understanding we have and probably influence over that culture for Christ. It behooves us to understand where we are and how we got here, and what are the underpinnings of the thoughts that have shaped the laws and the morals and the culture that surrounds us now.
And
Yeah,
he talks too about how important these ideas are. I mean, the title of the book is The Consequence of Ideas,
Yes.
right? And I love the introduction because he tells a story about as a young man trying to get a summer job, and he was a philosophy major. He couldn't get a good
Yeah.
internship, right? Nobody
Yeah.
appreciated it. Well, he met a German gentleman who was also working, pushing a broom as a janitor. And as he was talking to him, this gentleman described how his family, and this is a quote from the book, his family was destroyed because Hitler understood that ideas are dangerous. Hitler so feared the consequences of this guy's friend's ideas that he did everything possible to eliminate him and his ideas.
Wow.
So I think understanding those ideas is so important.
Yes. Good.
Well, there's so many bad ideas and they have such bad consequences. And so that's
Yeah.
another reason just to study that there's nothing new under sun. Everything that's happened today has happened before. So we just have to figure out what were some of the wise and maybe not wise solutions previously practiced by cultures, people, and, just leaders. And maybe that can give us some wisdom for today. It's really horrible. Ben Franklin said that experience is the dear price for knowledge. Right, that it's better to not have to experience, and he meant bad things and hard
Right.
things,
Right.
just have that wisdom ahead of time. And so this book can help with that also.
It's great. It's great.
So good.
All
Just
right.
like Paul did in Acts 17, right?
Mhm.
I mean, he was knowledgeable of what the Stoics and Epicureans and what the poets had taught the people, and able to engage them and turn it around and say, don't you
Right.
see, if this is true, it's all shot through with Christ, really. Because we know, as Augustine said, all truth is God's truth. So if we can find
Right.
it and something spoken by a pagan, we shouldn't just throw it off because he's not a believer, because the Lord gave him by common grace that little bit of truth that we can say, oh,
That little bit
that's
of
the Lord's
light.
too. Yeah.
And Brittany, you just showed how knowing your Bible well is so very helpful for everything else, because you recognize that the Stoics and the Epicureans were alluded to, as were the people who worship Diane and a number of other folks. And we get the same kind of pushback sometimes in classical conversations where parents are like, why do you have our children learn the names of the Greek and Roman gods? And my first answer is because they're in the Bible. But we tend to not notice that because we're not we don't know those cultures well. We don't know the history well.
Right.
So we do what Lisa said earlier, our eyes just go over those words. And so sometimes by meeting folks somewhere else, then as we're reading the scriptures, we can go, oh, that's who
Pops.
that is.
Yeah.
More
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah.
So,
It's
We
really
see
important.
connections. Yep. Those connections are very important.
Mhm.
all right. So do you want me to go ahead and it's time for the ad, or Kathy, do you want to add anything else before we go to the next section? You're
No,
good?
I'm good. I think we can move on.
Okay, good. Well, I just want to remind everybody that classicalconversationsbooks.com is our sponsor, and that's where the books we discuss each week can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken and 2024 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com. So you can go to my website and click on any of those links and purchase the books at classicalconversations.com. And then, like I mentioned earlier, you can always go to @LeeBortons on YouTube in order to watch previous episodes. And I look forward to hearing your feedback. And I just want to remind everybody that we are in this month of looking at some kind of heady topics that both our students and parents can engage in. And next week's going to be a little bit more relaxed, even though it's been kind of fun talking about these things. But Tilt-A-Whirl by N.D. Wilson is just a fun look at philosophy and some of its modern implications. And we're trying really hard to get N.D. on the show with us. So we'll see what happens. And so I invite you to look into that.
That'll be a lot of fun.
It would be.
So
He's a
fun.
fun guy. He's had a
Yeah.
lot of life experience. So, okay, Lisa, where are we
Okay.
going next? What are we
Okay.
doing?
All right. So we've been talking about the consequences of ideas, and we've probably all heard the pithy statement, ideas have consequences. And that actually was the title of a book that was written by Richard Weaver and published way back in 1948. So R.C. Sproul turns this statement on its head, and he named his book The Consequences of Ideas. So what students are going to do is they read this book, and as they talk, hopefully with their parents and with others in their community, students are going to consider the consequences of some of the major ideas from the ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and then also from Christian thinkers like Augustine and Anselm and Aquinas, as well as some, like Lee said, some significant modern philosophers like Marx and Hume and Kant and Nietzsche. So we always like to hear from the authors themselves, if we can, about why they wrote. So let's consider Sproul's stated purpose for writing this book. And this should make all of us heave a sigh of relief. Here it is. This book is written not for philosophy scholars, but for laypersons. I hope it serves as an enticing foretaste for future studies of theoretical thought. I hope you find this overview of the history of ideas helpful. So why do you guys think it's important for students to study an overview of the history of ideas?
I think, like Lee said earlier, there's nothing new under the sun. And
Yes.
so for students to be able to know that the arguments and ideas that they're encountering right now, which no one labels as philosophy, they just throw those ideas at them, those arguments all over. And what is the picture of the good life? How should I live? And what is my purpose? What is man's nature? I mean, the things that are thrown at us all the time. A student might be tempted to think, like I hear Christians saying this too, and I've thought this before in the past, like there's no other time on earth that's as dark as this one right now.
Right.
And yet, if we know a little bit of the history of ideas, then we can know that, wow, that thing that I just heard the congressman say on the television was actually an old argument from the ancients, but we think it's new. And so that can help kind of help our students be on the lookout for those things and to recognize them, and maybe not even to panic and be a little bit more calmer and say, okay, well, let's take that idea and let's think about it. Does this follow? Is this true? Does it measure up to reality? Or is this can't possibly be the way, a good explanation for things?
That's really good. That's good, Brittany. Somebody else. Why is it important for students to study an overview of the history of ideas?
So I'll go give Kathy some time to think if she wants. So some people, misrepresent what's expected in classical conversations, and I'm here to confess, I suppose, that I have read that book many times. I've read many philosophers. I've read, the other books we have in our philosophy curriculum. But I'm like anybody else that doesn't spend those thousands of hours studying a single subject. I'll forget. And I won't,
Yeah.
right. And I'll not always have the ideas at my fingertips. And so another reason that it's good to have this kind of a book and an overview of philosophy and history and timelines and those kind of things in our household is so that when something comes up again, I go, oh, I have a resource. And I'm
Yeah.
familiar with that resource. And there's a comfort in that. And so if somebody has a question and I'm thinking, I don't really know how to answer you, or I don't think you're right, I can say, can I get back to you? Because I know where to go get the information that I want to, have a better conversation with the person. So the other thing that studying this overview of history of ideas and philosophies does is it mostly for everybody, if you actually read it, and even if you just trace your eyes over it, like Lisa said, it begins to build your vocabulary. And it's hard to discuss any area of knowledge if you don't have some basic vocabulary.
Right.
So I don't want anybody to think, you leave challenge 2 having read this, or it's a 3, challenge 3, having read this book. You're armed for all the battles, you have in college, but it's a
That's
really
right.
good book to take with you and to keep on on your bookshelf. And so building a library is just really important to a classical, just a classicalist. And Jennifer says I say that wrong. She thinks it's classicus. I don't know what it is. I'm gonna find out the right
We
word.
know what we mean by it, though, don't we? I think that's really good. And I think it's great for our kids, even the ones that maybe didn't sink their teeth into this study as deeply as we wished they had. They at least have a taste of it and they recognize it again when they hear it. They think, okay, I know, or I'm supposed to know something about that. And like Lee said, they can go and refresh their memory because the book lives with them.
I think it really sticks with students more than we think too.
Mhm.
I heard that at the commencement ceremony for CC, that
Oh.
a lot of those kids really appreciated this book because it helped them prepare for some of the crazy ideas that they would encounter in college. This is from former CC students,
Mm.
so
Mm.
I
Yeah.
think
That's
it is
super
just a great
good.
overview.
It's a great preparation indeed. All right, so let's look at another section from the introduction. Brittany, will you read that section for us that we've marked?
Sure. Philosophy forces us to think foundationally. And by foundational, I mean first principles or basic truths. Most ideas that shape our lives are accepted, at least initially, somewhat uncritically. We do not create a world or environment from scratch and then live in it. Rather, we step into a world and culture that already exists and we learn to interact with it. For example, few people today debate the virtues of a graduated or progressive income tax, in which one group pays not only more money, but also a higher percentage of their income. How unlike the tithe, God's flat tax. Rarely does anyone challenge the justness of such a scheme because it has been enforced for so long. It's an accepted reality. When enacted, however, it was the focus of fierce controversy.
And for our
Mm.
listeners, just, that was page 9 and 10 of the book.
Yeah. Yeah. So right there at the beginning, you're jumping into these good whys and
Mhm.
what is the foundational and even some examples of those things. So what first principles have you had to define better over time? So what first principles have, so you guys think about that. What are some basic truths or first principles that you've needed to define better over time? And how has philosophy helped you do that?
I can start with that.
Mhm.
There's a principle that that we read about with Descartes, and he used reasoning, right? And so he was talking about the idea of perfection. He said, if we have the idea of perfection, that perfection is a real thing, then its cause must also be a real thing. In other words, only a
Hmm.
perfect being, God,
Hmm.
could cause this idea of perfection in us. And I just loved the way R.C. Sproul described
Mhm.
how he reasoned through that. And so that has forced me to think about a lot of things in those same terms and learn more about the characteristics of God. Love. Why do we know what love is? Because God is love. Or
Mm.
why do we know what justice is? And
Mhm.
we recognize that because God is just. And so I know those are biblical principles, but having read about it with Descartes just solidified it even more.
Mm,
That's
That's
great.
good.
I'm still thinking, Brittany.
Okay. So I
Mhm.
think like the ancients, the first chapter talks about some of the ancient philosophers, Socrates and those who preceded him. And they were
Mhm.
looking for like the one thing that would hold all things together. So as
Right.
Christians, that caught my eye or my ear thinking about, maybe it's my mind. I guess it caught my mind. I was thinking about what is it that holds all things together? We know from scripture that must be Christ, and yet there was this longing in those who had not yet received Christ um, to try and look for the thing that would hold all things together. We know that all kinds of people had different ideas. Like my students really love it that when we talk about Pythagoras and how he thought number was the thing that
Mhm.
held all things together. When you think about it, you understand why he was trying to create order, a cosmology kind of to be able to say this is where all things came from. So studying
Mhm.
philosophy helps us ask questions like, where did all of this come from?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. For me, I would say that I daily live with these two questions, and they're answered by all of these folks, but I'll bring in some more modern context. And the one is follow the money. So Rush Limbaugh, right? And this
Yeah.
example from Sproul is once again about money, and the the thing that I try to remember is the job of the money is not to run into my pocket. The job of the money is to serve other people. And so then you tie that to, well, what's the purpose of government? And then what's the purpose of the church? And then what's the purpose of a father? And these are all questions that are asked and challenged, in this book. And so it does really have bearing on, our daily lives. The other one that I got out of this book, as well as continue to read, like Menes is one of the other people we read, and the questions that these guys asked, is that everybody has a dogma. And one of the worst things I think a parent can think is, I want my children to have their own ideas, because guess what? They will. They will have ideas, and they will have bad ideas if somebody hasn't helped them think through good ideas. And there's nothing wrong with having strong ideas, which people will call dogma, because if you don't have a strong wall, you can't push against it. And so by knowing really what you believe and why you believe it, a new idea comes and you can push against it against your own wall and your own ideas and go, what do I think about this? Because, I'm going to say this badly because it's on top of my head, but that basically most people's feet are firmly planted in midair. And we're trying to help children know where these ideas come, so they're not surprised when Paul quotes a prayer about Zeus. Paul was going to pay attention to his culture, and he was going to use it to compare God. And so we're going to pay attention to these philosophers, to our scriptures, and to current events and other people who influence our lives. And I think that's C.S. Lewis's kind of definition of a proficient reader is two things: not just someone who reads the same books over and over again, but someone who can read many books and synthesize the ideas.
Yes.
And so this is a beginning way to say, okay, you've been reading these wonderful coming of age stories. You've been reading and studying things and classical conversations that are a lot more related to you because you were a child. And now we're saying you need to start looking outwards and finding other resources. So to look out and up, and to know dogma's okay, and to know it's okay to follow the money.
That's right.
Great. That's great. Okay. Kathy, read a little bit more for us from pages 10 and 11 there in the introduction.
Sure. He says, foundational thinking lays bare all of our assumptions so that we may discover those assumptions that are false and often lethal. Foundational thinking cares about the differences between truth and falsehood because it cares about good and evil. The ancient maxim still applies: the unexamined life is not worth living. To any serious thinker, and especially to the professing Christian, an unexamined life is not an option.
Right. And he says there, especially to the professing Christian, an unexamined life is not an option. So how does this foundational thinking apply to Christians?
So one thing, then you two can address next. It's a big question I have. The longer I am I'll start back. When I first became a Christian, I had been forgiven much, and much was expected of me, and much was given to me. And the love and the welcoming was amazing. So much fruit and candy and milk and good things like that. But then, of course, as you mature, it becomes chewier. Paul speaks about the meat of the mature Christian. And meat's tough, and with it come tough questions and things that you thought the more you know the God of the universe, the more you go, yeah, I don't know anything.
Yeah.
Right. So you've got, some relativism might creep in, and trying to figure out, okay, how do I counteract that? Because his truth is what's true. And yet we don't know everything. And so one of the questions that I have for myself as a Christian is to ask, when people of sincere belief who are different than me, is to step back and say to myself, Lord, let me see how they see it. I just am not in agreement. And so as a Christian who wants to love the unlovable, and I find that very hard. It's really way easier to dislike people and just hang out with who you want to hang out with. I think that the unexamined life is what makes us better at witnessing the gospel, because we try to ask the common questions and topics to get to know other people's ideas better. That doesn't mean that I'm saying anything that truth is truth. What I've begun to realize is truth is always truth. Understanding is not always understanding. And that's usually where our differences lie. So
Mhm.
That's so good.
I think that the examination is really important, and it's important that we be intentional about that, because there are a lot of assumptions. There are a lot of things that we just assume to be true because we've always thought that way, and all the people that we hang out with have always thought that way, and that's a comfortable way for me to think. And if I keep thinking that way, I can keep living the way I'm living, and that feels good. But the whole thing, the foundational thinking and philosophy really lays bare all our assumptions, and it reveals our false beliefs. So, like, why do you believe that? If you only believe that because it is situationally comfortable, I mean, where is the truth in that? And so it forces you to dig deeper and say, but is that true? And is that everywhere applicable? Because truth should be applicable in all situations to all people. And a lot of my assumptions are only applicable for me because they're working out well for me in the moment. And so I think that's really important for our kids. And Lee, you talked about, our students are at this point when they're studying this or conversing about it. They're at the point where they are doing the coming of age thing and discovering what their purposes are and what they want to be, examining what are my life purposes. And you have to stop and think, okay, so how are you going to choose those life purposes? Is it based on what will make you feel good, or what will make your family feel good, or make you popular? Or is it based on something deeper than that? Is it based on honor and virtue and truth and beauty? And philosophy forces you to define those things and wrestle with them.
That's so true.
It can help us in just even basic decisions or actions or behaviors that we need, because we always need, we only discover truth, like you all are saying, through examining the assumptions that we have, the understanding that we have. And so as we make decisions, what are my assumptions about truth in maybe the activities I want my children to be involved in, or, my daily schedule, something as mundane as that. There's still underlining assumptions.
Yeah. 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 All right. I'm going to read just a short section from chapter 1, The First Philosophers. And if you're looking at a copy of the book, it's on page 13. Okay. The origins of Western philosophy are rooted in the ancient Aegean world. A sharp distinction between science and philosophy was unknown to thinkers of that day. The word science in its etymology simply means knowledge, and the term philosophy derives from love of wisdom. As ancient man sought to understand himself and the world around him, knowledge and wisdom were interrelated ideas. He was concerned about the nature of things. Okay, now this paragraph is full of lots of words that you and your student might want to stop and define. So what words stand out to you guys? Which ones should we define?
I'd grab my map and look for the ancient Aegean world.
Yep.
Yeah,
I knew
that'd be
you would
fun.
do that. That'd be perfect. That would be a perfect way to use a few minutes. Okay. And you could even talk about, how far is this from the beginning place, the birth of civilization?
From Sumer.
Yeah. And so that's cool. How far did have people spread, and how might ideas have changed, and all that good stuff? What else?
I would probably talk about science and philosophy, because we don't today typically link those two things, put those two things together. And he is stating that there was no distinction between those things at that time. So that gives me a little bit of idea of like the history of education and thought. Those two things weren't separated, because we tend to think about science as things that can be
empirically proven,
empirically known, tested and experimented upon. And they were linking that kind of knowledge with philosophy too, which would be moral philosophy and theology even.
That's good. I would probably first think about the Aegean world, like you said, but then also who are they defining as ancient man?
Mm.
You know, what time
Yeah,
period are we talking
good.
about there?
Good.
Mhm.
And they're mentioning the Aegean world, so I assume he's not talking about, say, the ancient Chinese or
Right.
Asia, because he talks about Western.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's talking around Italy, basically Greece, Italy,
Right.
northern
Mhm.
Africa,
Mm-hmm.
where the Aegean Sea is feeding into the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which would be the first three chapters of the book, you know, the Greeks and Plato and Aristotle, I think.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
When you
Mhm.
think like
Mm-hmm.
Alexander the Great, he was an African.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like it's a big world there. It's not small.
Yeah.
And
Right.
the map and the timeline help you enter into where these philosophers must fit in the God story.
Yes.
Mhm.
And how they ended up traveling. How did they even meet each
Mhm.
other? These people, they didn't take a train, you know?
No.
Well,
And so,
then you start thinking about the influence of this philosophy in the Greeks on the
mm,
Romans, and then how Christ came
Mhm.
in the
mm-hmm,
time of the
Mhm.
Romans.
Mhm.
And the
mm-hmm,
language of thought was already there
Yeah.
for the
Mhm.
mm-hmm,
message.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that last sentence, he was concerned about the nature of things. And when you
Mhm.
said, you know, a spiritual, when you're thinking about the Bible, what is the nature of man? What is the
Mhm.
nature of God? And how do you know? Um,
Yeah. So one thing Brittany kind of brought up was the three natures. The one is historically, and moderns have lost
mhm,
this. They've replaced this with this perversion called STEM. But they
mm,
used to look at what was called natural history, which would be,
right?
that's a bluebird, and then natural science. I have a question. Why is that bluebird got red eyes and this other one has, green, I don't know, color eyes, brown eyes, something like that, where
Yeah,
you're asking questions about it
right.
and
Mhm.
then moving on to natural philosophy. Where'd those birds come from and why are they
Mhm.
here and what are
Why
they
are they
supposed to do
here?
with them? Right. And
Yeah,
so those three realms of nature, when you're talking about the nature of things, I think that has a lot to
right.
do that with we're technical machines and it's how we think of science right now. And so our humanity is under attack and it all
Mm,
goes together. And so knowing that I just hope some challenge three student will read this and go, wait a minute, they used to think men could be defined.
yeah.
How about that simple
Yeah.
idea?
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and that feeds into the question I was getting ready to ask you. How does reading and discussing passages like this bless our students at home and in community? By having a student who says, wait a minute, you could define
Mhm.
a man?
Yeah.
How can we do
Mhm.
this? You know? How do you guys think? How does discussing passages like this bless students? If they get to have these discussions at home, it's wonderful. If they have them in community, it's also wonderful.
I know for our family, I mean, discussing it at home has led to all kinds of new questions. Like when he talks about his cave and he gives us a little summary of it, we wanted to go read
Yeah.
Plato's Cave and
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
experience the story, which is really short. And
Right.
because maybe we're confused by just a little summary of that story. So that's
Mm,
been really good. And to wrestle with when we started thinking about how people understood things or how they came to understand what truth is or where knowledge comes from, all of these are big questions. And
mhm,
so my students at home, my children have been able to talk about those things with us and then go to community where they have an opportunity to lead that conversation. Sometimes they take turns leading, guided by the tutor. Um, and that's a different thing than just picking up a what did you think about this book, this
right.
story that we read for literature. It's different to
Mhm,
start thinking about questions like, how do I know that this is true? And
mhm.
this year I got to tutor a challenge 3 class, and the week we studied Nietzsche was the week of the solar eclipse. And
Oh.
so my students and our whole community, we did as much as we could outside and we got special glasses. And so I don't think they will ever forget. One of my students has a truck that he uses for his own business. So we climbed up in the back of his truck. Some of us stood around the edge, and one of the students it was his turn to lead about Nietzsche and that chapter. And so we started sharing. He was asking us questions, and just when we were talking about the darkness of his ideas, it got really dark. And then the light came out. I mean, this is not a normal, this was just a blessing from God that he organized this for us that day, but we will never forget it. And my student, this particular student who I think has pastoral leanings, and he's very much involved in the local college too, as he's studying. And he said, well, can you seek wisdom without seeking truth? And then he said, well, what if you believe in truth, but the people you're talking to at school don't believe in truth? I try to talk to people all the time in my classes, and they can't tell me that they believe in truth. So how do you share truth with people who don't believe in it? And so that led us into a conversation about, well, how would Socrates have led a conversation like that? Well, how would Jesus have responded in that? What should we do? What kind of questions should we ask? And it was so fruitful. I mean, it was just something. In fact, we all left challenged to have our eyes open to opportunities like that the Lord might give us, so that we could talk about real things in a world that's so confusing, and who says, most people don't believe that there is truth. Well, I don't know if it's most, but many don't, and they're vocal about it.
And how cool that the answer was centuries ago. Some ideas. He's taking ideas from centuries ago with him to college to talk to people. That's cool.
So Lisa, I think you have a great question to end with. You want to ask that for 2
minutes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. This book is an introductory overview of the consequences of lots of big ideas. Lee, what is it that you hope our students and their parents will gain?
I hope that they will gain the friendships of Brittany Lewis, Kathy Denigi, and Lisa Bailey. I am so thrilled that my friends teach young people to look back and to look up, and they do it outside with great books. And so that is my hope, is that every parent who feels floundering finds a friend like you guys. So thank you so much for being with me today. And I look forward to next week, hoping ND Wilson will make it.
All right. That sounds great. This was fun. Thank you, Lee.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. See you guys next time.
Thank you.